How did you incur any damage, Gerry? Anyway, it's fun.
No, we're blessed. Electricity didn't go, water didn't go, but the town was destroyed. Like, I wrote a little piece about it. It's more a satirical piece on the name itself of the storm. EOW.
Is it Owen or what?
Well, this is the thing. It was like
It's a transgender name, I think, is it?
It was phonetically, to my ear, it was like Owen. EOIN or Father OIN. And so I was playing around with that in the article, that it was actually, the name is taken from The Lord of the Rings, a character in The Lord of the Rings from J.R.R. Tolkien. Yeah. So it was kind of just playing around. It was much more of a storm Mick, like, it was real sturdy.
Yeah, Mick would be a better name for it. But you see, there's no Micks like out there. They're all Hermione and all these kind of, and it's like, they're all kind of D4 names. I lost a greenhouse down the west.
How'd you manage that?
yeah. Like, honest to God, it literally broke every painted glass in the greenhouse and buckled the frame, so it's completely beyond repair. It's right off. But now the shed as well incurred a bit of damage, tarpaulin ripped off and all that. There's so many things you could really say about this, Gerry, but I have deep suspicions about it, even though I can't have at the moment, I don't have the evidence in my hand, but it seems to me that this is wildly, so to speak, coincidental with all the other run of events we've been having. That, not just in Ireland and the whole saga for the last 5 years with the COVID and all this other stuff, but also in the recent past with like Hawaii and Los Angeles very recently, these kind of extraordinary, extreme weather events. And like this seems to be, where I lost the greenhouse was in Sligo, in North Sligo, and it is a rough place. A place called Maharao, and you can tell that that's a rough place, by the name of it. Like the wind is there. Like I used to hear like people going on about with a few gusts in Dublin, and there'd be Micheál Martin would be calling around door to door telling people to stay away from the coast and not mind themselves, because he was very concerned about people. But in Sligo, like 3 nights a week at least, between October and March, you get that kind of weather in Sligo. But you wouldn't lose a greenhouse.
No.
And you wouldn't lose the roof. And I mean, I've had fairly rough, and I often wonder, oh God, is the roof of the shed gone now? Because it wouldn't be the best repair. Wouldn't be. So like, this is orders of magnitude beyond that.
It was definitely, as somebody said it to me, it was, a case of where the boy cried wolf and the wolf showed up.
Yeah.
So there was that element for me. There was a big 4 or 5 day lead up to this storm coming, which I found a bit unusual.
Amazing.
As in that it was precise.
Well, no, Gerry, I have to disagree with you there, because they said it would start at 4 a.m. on Friday morning, and I'd swear now it was nearly 5 past before I heard the first gust, because I was up at that time in the morning and I was waiting for it.
I was just going to bed.
So, and another thing I noticed, and I don't know, I haven't been, but we happened to be in Dublin at the time, and obviously all the talk seemed to be about Dublin, and all the apps were showing that squiggly symbol you get for wind. And I looked at the apps for Sligo, nothing. Galway, nothing. Castlebar, nothing. No wind, no squiggly bits. Right up to the end, right up to Friday. Isn't that interesting?
I didn't. Yeah, it is.
And yet they were the places most affected. Now,
and still affected.
That tells me, Gerry, that there's some kind of disjunction between the forecasting apparatus and the storm apparatus. Mm-hmm. Now, you see, I've been watching this. It seems to me, first, one of the primary aspects of this, we'll be told, this is climate change. Now, that's nonsense. For the reason that you can't tie climate change into weather. They're two different things.
Well, I'll disagree with you first. On one thing, you can call it climate change if you will allow the variable of geoengineering into your factoring of the term climate change.
Yes.
So that element isn't
100%.
part of that
100%.
element is not part of what we hear people calling climate change.
Exactly right, and we'll come back to that, Gerry. But this book, I really recommend people read. If you really ever come across this book, I tell everybody, Unsettled it's called, Stephen E. Coonan, and the title more or less has the message of the book, which is that the climate change question is not settled. Far from being the consensus we're told that it is of scientists, is not settled. And there's this guy, Stephen E. Coonan, very odd source for me to be quoting, because he worked for Barack Obama as his climate advisor for 2 years back about 2009-10. And he says that when you look at all the different things, the models they use, the point he makes about this issue of climate and weather is that weather is a day-to-day event. Climate is a 30-year to 30-year event. In other words, the metrics are entirely different. So you need to stand right back from the picture if you're going to decide that there's a connection between climate and weather. You need to stand right back, going back. So we would need to be now going back at this point to at least the late 80s and making our comparisons on that basis. They're not doing that. Their models are completely useless. And that's another point he makes, that the models they're using are completely unreliable. Now, and what he actually says, it's unsettled. There's no consensus about this whatsoever. It's a completely fake consensus that they're talking about. Now, the geoengineering, yeah, you're right, because what they're been doing, Maria, is that they're now they're acknowledging that they're actually doing this stuff. And lots of governments, Spanish government, for example, is saying about the spraying. People have been seeing it for years and they've been called conspiracy theorists and all this. But you just look at the sky any summer's day and you see these lines, and next thing it's a big haze. And they're saying they're doing this. And the reason they're saying it, they're trying to block out the sun in order to reduce the effects of warming, of global warming, etc. But in actual fact, there's two possibilities here. One is that there's a direct intervention in this, as there must have been, or seems to have been, in both Hawaii and Los Angeles. That these were actually some forms of strikes. They were actually not spontaneous weather events at all. But there's also the possibility that it's the effect, the cumulative effect of all this interference with the climate.
Well, this is where I would say I could subscribe to climate change in that kind of categorization, is that, if there were to be a good example would be if the 2004 tsunami that hit Southeast Asia, or is it 2003 or 4, hit now, that was more or less treated as an act of God, we'll say, and there was some, murmurs about climate change and global warming and all this. But if that hit tomorrow, I'd say the governments, at least in the Western world, would use that event in. First of all, they wouldn't be as inclined to call it an act of God. And if we look at this recent storm, that won't be in any way classified in such terms as we might have classified weather like this 15 or 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So those questions kind of swirl into my mind when we're talking on this kind of subject.
Yeah, the comparison they were making, I think, was Storm Debbie, Hurricane Debbie or whatever, and that was the worst equivalent. That's like nearly 60 years ago. It is 60 years ago. I was a child at the time. I remember it. I remember Debbie. I remember actually but I don't think it was as bad as this.
I certainly can't. The visuals of this storm, I can't remember one that's had an impact like it's had.
No.
Like, the 2-3 days out, electricity's still out, post office is still closed. A lot of, a lot of the infrastructure of our society is still closed 2-3 days after the event. And that's part of my question as well at the moment, or to talk about.
Is that a way of underlining the climate change thing? These are the consequences you're going. That, in other words, they're imposing on people consequences. A bit like they've been doing with cars, restricting left turns and right turns and making life as difficult as possible. So they're creating log jams in the mornings and in the evenings in order to just basically spite people who insist on bringing their cars because they have no proper public transport to use. And so this is a similar thing, I think. Just go slow. Don't bother. We were told actually it could take a week to restore. Now, the first phrase that came into my head when I heard that, Gerry, was, import the third world, become the third world. Here, welcome to the third world.
Well, this is the thing, because if you think the lead up, and we have this infrastructure built in our kind of civil service that kicks into action now with red warnings, orange warnings, all this stuff. We seem to have 4 or 5 days preparation for this storm. But the aftermath is like the structures, like our electricity network, blocked roads, telegraph poles and wires down. That infrastructure seems almost like third world.
The predictive infrastructure is top class.
Yeah.
Now that's exactly a reversal of what used to be the case. All my life was with severe weather events when they would happen, like snow, which is a terrible thing that happens in the wintertime. And they would never get it. They would never predict it, and then it would come. And everybody would be outraged, and the whole country would close down for a day and a half. But now they can predict it to within 5 minutes for the beginning and the end, because they were telling us that it was going to stop
and it did end
at 11 a.m. on Friday morning, which it did in Dublin.
Yeah, it did in the West too. More or less, it was done and dusted by lunchtime.
That's astonishing predictive capacity, isn't it?
I suppose one thing about the west of Ireland is that the first people out were the farmers with their chainsaws. The byroads, the byroads were open within 2 or 3 hours. The telegraph poles and the ESB lines that are on the same roads are still down, right?
Yeah.
So there is that. The West seems to still have that
interesting
coherence in their DNA to get moving.
It's kind of a sort of an expression of the honour culture that preceded the so-called rule of law that we are, labouring under nowadays. That people do for themselves, if they're let alone by the state, far better job more quickly than if the state actually does it, and it costs nothing.
Yeah.
And in other words, it is the argument, and it's a pretty good one, I think, in general, that if the government would just clear off for a couple of years and leave us in peace, we'd have a right little country at the end of it.
I was down visiting a couple of lads. They're living off the grid, and their wood cabin. There was by the time I got down, there was a big hole inside of it. It was on stilts, and they were pretty relaxed about it, to be honest with you. But I was driving back, and I had to come into Loughrea to get back on the motorway. So I pulled into Supermax. These big Supermax petrol stations that are dotted along, and Evergreen or whatever they're called on the motorways. But when I went into the park, it was like Armageddon, because there was queues going out nearly to the petrol pumps for people queuing for Supermax to get something to eat. And I was like, oh, this is how you react to this. You can't, or we react to this, is we don't have the self-sufficiency ability to boil a pot of water on a gas stove, or our only means is to go collectively to this place. And I just thought there was something worrying in that. Do you know what I mean?
Very interesting point, Gerry. Because it struck. I was amazed by my own response to this disaster. I'll just give you an example. The night before, this just shows you how the weird way that the mind works. The night before, we had been only coming up from Sligo, and when we got to Dublin, to where we live, it's near Dunleary, the road was blocked. There was some road works, and there was a guy there with a young guy, and he was waving people on. But the particular road we needed to go in, we needed to go down there because there's no other way of getting in, other than you go up a one-way street the wrong way, which of course, try to explain this to a thick guard, doesn't, I don't care, I'm booking you, and that's the end of it. But, so I did, but there was a little shortcut, which I went down a narrow little road, and a lot of turns and walls, and I just grazed one of the stones of the wall going by, right? And it give one of those nasty little, to make you look like a total clocker. You know what I mean? People start looking. You would think everybody's looking at this, but I kind of, and then I kind of calmed down and said, "Listen, it's okay." The next day, when I heard about the greenhouse, didn't knock a feather out of me. I just said, "Okay, that's life," and that's a really interesting thing. What you're talking about there in the context of, this dependency that people have, is related to this kind of new phenomenon where the state comes in on everything and does everything for people, and says, and then they complain if the state isn't fast enough or whatever, or if something bad happens, it's the state's fault to fix it, so on. My kind of instinct, I wasn't necessarily thinking in these terms, but it's like I instinctively realised or recognised that this is an act of God, as we used to call it, right? And therefore, that's life.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's no point in whinging about it. We'll just have a look at it when we are in better form for looking at it, and that'll be that. And then either get a new greenhouse or not.
And there's a collective, spontaneous community interaction when these things happen normally. Certainly when I would have grown up with them, where you've been given this reason to come together, do you know what I mean? And there's a certain excitement in that.
That's right, yeah. And a neighbour down there actually contacted me and said, he asked me, how did you suffer any damage down there? And I kind of said, the greenhouse, he says, he says, I saw it, he says, but I didn't want to say it. So, but, that's, it's a very interesting thing, though. That's why, in a way, the older people were so resilient.
Oh yeah, and they still have a bit. Even my own mother, and she's nearly, I won't say what age she is, but my brother was ringing her to her phone, and water and electricity is still gone, so he was ringing me, and he was going to bring her down to his place, and my mother didn't want to go because all the neighbours were coming into her. It was nice to see there's still a lot of it in rural west of Ireland anyway, is that she didn't want to miss all these visitors coming into her, that kind of way.
Yeah. But this thing of, though, that the government, and that when there's a few gusts of wind, that the Taoiseach has to make a address to the nation and tell people to stay away from the coast, and things like this, nonsensical stuff. What business is of the Taoiseach whether I go to the coast or not? Any more than when the lockdown was on, whether it was their business to actually tell me I can't go any more than 2 kilometres from my house. No. Keep out of it. Stick your nose out of our business. We're adults. We look after ourselves, and we look after those who we're responsible for. You look after the economy and a few little bits and pieces like that. Fill the potholes, that's really it. We're not asking much. Just stay out of it.
Because you can't even give us the things back that you're responsible for, like the ESB network. And stuff saying a week to get that back. Right? Yeah. That's grand. If it was left to, we'll say, the old county councils, or in today's world, to get the roads unblocked, they would probably still be blocked. Do you know what I mean? A lot of these kind of...
And I wonder how much of an influence that the privatisation of electricity has had on this whole process as well. Because when you had just one monopoly, semi-state organisation, it seemed to work a lot better,
Well, I don't know. I haven't heard of any data centre being without electricity.
No. Oh, well, of course, no, Gerry, that's much more important. Snooping on people is far more important than feeding them or heating their houses. Come on, Gerry, now get with it.
I was reading a piece you were writing. You referenced David McWilliams there recently.
Yeah.
And I had done something on him a while back, but it was kind of in line with, the data centres. And I've seen a couple of journalists kind of pick up that thread of thought from him, because he's somebody I would have probably listened to a lot 20 years ago and had a good amount of respect for his opinions back then as well. But I've come to see him as he's almost like the south face of globalism. That and the reason I'm bringing this up is when he wrote about data centers, it was more or less a kind of an article that says, well, we all have pictures on our phones and videos, and we all want to keep them, and pictures of Granny and this. It's very much appealing to our personal use of technology, and as a result, we have to store it. When that isn't what we're talking about in these data centers at all. Like an Amazon data center is for Amazon customers. Yeah. Amazon's a lot of their business is AI. AI produces tons and tons of more data that has to be stored. I have a problem with that kind of, misrepresentation, and especially when they are obviously in a situation we find ourselves in with this storm. They have the means, obviously they'll have the means for backup supplies and all that, but we're the ones paying the price on the electricity network.
Yeah. Well, the thing I picked up was not unrelated to that in the sense that what he was saying was quite surprising, actually. We might need to reduce inward migration because our services are running down and we're not able to keep up, and there was a sentence which I can't remember exactly, but it was almost like saying like that, you have to, you must be conscious of the needs of the people of your society. What a radical idea.
Your position as the leader of the far right might be under threat.
Oh, my goodness, that's a very, 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 very radical extremist position now, to be saying that the government is responsible for ensuring the supply of basic services of a certain kinds to the people. David was an interesting character. I knew David quite well way back before I was cancelled, and he was a nice guy, smart guy. I did a lot of bits and pieces with him. I was involved in the very early stages in when he started the Dalkey Book Festival. I was involved in publicising and went out and did interviews and all that to launch it the first year, I think 2009. Haven't been invited for a while now, about a decade or more, a dozen years maybe. And I noticed in that time too, way back then, he was quite a sober, stable guy. I mean, he was actually making arguments against massive inward migration. He was warning about it then, back about 2007 or so. And then he kind of went quiet, and then he met Bono. And, that was that.
Yeah, it was this come to Jesus moment.
Yeah, but now it's interesting. He's now saying this, that it might be necessary. And I my intuition about that, Gerry, that was that an article like that, given the policy of the newspaper, would not have been spontaneously kind of generated, in the sense that it wouldn't just be written up and we'll just throw that in, and because you'd be kind of expecting a call on foot of an article like that, I'd say, in the Irish Times as it exists now. So it seems to me that it was some kind of signal. You see, there may actually be in these quarters a degree of panic about what they've done to our country.
I think there might be, because I think that article or whatever it was is following up on reporting that 3 years in a row inward migration has been at over 140 or 150,000 per year. Now that's just the base numbers that they're giving us. I would personally think that's quite a lot higher when we factor in, and it will be much higher in the future when we factor in, I think it was Neil Redmond before Christmas, where if you get a work visa now, it's an automatic spouse's visa as well. And kids. So I don't even know if those numbers are just factoring in the person with the visa and their family, or is it factoring in just the person? And I think it's just probably the person.
You see, there's so many categories that it's very hard to keep track, like what they're saying at any given moment. Like, because they sometimes they're talking about asylum seekers as if that's the sole thing. Then they talk about refugees, which is a much broader category. They're not talking about legal migration much. But in fact, if you look at the streetscapes, legal migration has been the biggest issue.
Well, that's
unspoken. If you look at it, there's no surveys like of who's employed in the corporate sector in Ireland. Could we get a breakdown of that? How many Irish people are actually working there? That kind of stuff. So, in fact, David McWilliams said as much himself in this article. That if you look around you on the street, which is what we've been saying for years in the far right, like if you look at Dublin, I've been doing this for years now, just as a matter of interest for myself, that I might go, very occasionally I go into Dublin. I don't like it anymore. It's not a nice place. But I have to go in occasionally, and I usually go in on the Dart and get off maybe in Tara Street or Pearse Street. And then wherever I'm going, I'll walk, and on the way I'll do a kind of a survey, informal, to myself, based on appearance and to the extent I can hear voices, accents. And back about 6-7 years ago, I call it Spot the Paddy, and the paddy count was roughly about 30% at that time. That means 70% were not paddies, right? I did it there last year, probably around in the summer, early summer. I did it between Tara Street and the Four Courts, and both times, and up and down. And the figure I got there was, I had some uncertainty as to, there seemed to be a lot of people whose accents and faces didn't match, shall we say. So that they looked like Irish, but they weren't when you heard them speak, right? We'll put it like that. So if you don't count those, I would say the figure of paddies was about 15%. If you do, you're down to 10%. That's now in the centre of Dublin.
Well, I did this. Well, inadvertently, I kind of did the same thing. I was writing an article after the child stabbings in November. Is it 23? So I went up to the school to have a look at where the location of it was on Parnell Square. But I remember wherever I parked the car, I got lost. I ended up walking through Summerhill and down in kind of coming at Parnell Square from the north, and walked down O'Connell Street, and I came to that number as well, 85. I even went into a local supermarket there just to say, well, maybe this is just passing traffic, people getting buses, but I put it in just on the visuals, that's all, and the
visuals,
voices.
yeah.
And so
you lose some of that if you count the audio.
Yeah.
That's what I was finding. But I couldn't say exactly what, but I was saying it is around 10%.
Yeah.
So that's 90% are non-Irish on the main thoroughfares in Dublin in the middle of the week, in the middle of the day. What's that telling you about what the overall figure? See, they're misleading us radically as to the actual figures. They're talking about 20%. It was 20% 5 years ago they were giving us. They're still giving us 20%. Meanwhile, we've taken in the guts of 1 million people, I would say.
It's indicative, if you like, in a weird way, of saying we were right, what we were talking about 2 years ago. Yeah. It's not like you can wake up tomorrow morning and, start sending people back to their current countries of origin. It's almost like that argument you had about, when the number we decide we want to have each year, when we get to the +1 of that number, can we just say
no?
No. But nobody ever talks about an annual number.
No. And they would be just as horrified by you saying no to that as they were to you saying no to the first one to come. That's the trap for this country and for its future, because there's no. You see, behind this, there's a number of factors. Obviously, there's deep malevolent planning in order to replace the population. That's without question. That's in UN policy. It was Peter Sutherland's policy. He actually articulated that policy in the House of Lords back, I think, in 2008, and he's been articulated in Ireland. And his disciples, Coveney, Radker, Harris, whatever, Martin, these guys are implementing this policy. We have had no discussion about any of this. There's been no politician that I know of went to the public in Ireland saying, I'm going to bring in, hundreds of thousands of people and over your head. I'm not going to consult you. We're not going to ask your opinion. We're going to assume that your community is our property to do it as we please. You have no say in about who your children have to mix with, who's living next, anything like that. You see, one of the tricks that's always been played is this idea that there's no difference between 1 and 1 million. So, like, if they move like the 200 people into a village of 110, you say people have no veto over who comes into their community. Mm-hmm. What is a community? Of course they have a veto. They have to have. Now, that would make a certain sense if it was one person or one family or even two families. They say, okay, don't be unreasonable. You know, like you've got the accommodation, there's houses there, they can afford to buy a house or whatever. They're working in the village, and people would say, sure, but 200? That's not the same thing. And this is obvious, like. You see, this is one of the things that's happened, Gerry, that's really shocking, is the collapse of reason, the kind of common sense things that people used to understand, that are no longer available in the public realm now because of the pseudo-reality that I talk about, where the media is completely corrupt and will not support any idea that isn't part of the agenda and will attack any idea that isn't part of the agenda. So, like you go back to Aristotle, like 2,500 years ago. He was onto this whole idea that this idea of compassion or generosity is not, an absolutist thing. You can't say that generosity is always a good thing. It happens on a spectrum, and the best place on that spectrum is in the middle. So you say, well, on one hand, at the extreme, there's meanness. You might say racism, you might say xenophobia, you might say all those things. But on the other, there's complete recklessness about your own country, about your children's future, about your children's homeland. So if you're going to do this, you're going to have to find a median line.
Well, the problem I have with that, and I agree with I do agree with all that, is the weaponization of the generosity of the Irish spirit.
Yeah.
Is what's happening, really.
It has, yeah.
And when you said, the only bit I'd add to what, these people, Micheál Martin, whether it's Varadkar or whoever it has been over the last 5 years, is, and we saw this with the referenda last year, when 60-70% were against what they were saying, in the media, they're coming out in front of the camera saying, 85% of the country agree with us on this. When, in fact, it's the almost diametric opposite to that number.
Well, there's another factor, Gerry, which feeds into the same thing, which is a corruption of the Christian message, right? And the Catholic message, Catholic social teaching, or teaching, full stop, which they're telling, the bishops and the priests come out and praise this thing as if, and they seem to imply that no matter how many people come to Ireland, we have to accept them. And even if that means us leaving Ireland, we have to accept them. Like, that it's like compassion, Christian compassion. Jesus said, everybody's entitled to come to your country, and everybody's entitled in the final analysis to move into your house. That's kind of the logic, right? That is not the teaching of the church whatsoever, nor should it be, nor would it be if you actually use your head and think, well, what would be a reasonable position of the church? Well, funnily enough, when you go and look at the root of all this teaching of the church in this context, you go to Thomas Aquinas, which is back nearly 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, and the immigration.
And he says very clearly, there's three kinds of migration. Number one is short term. We call that nowadays tourism. No problem. Is there a problem? No. Second would be what he calls shorter term stays, contracts, longer term but not, Mm-hmm. So that would be maybe students maybe, coming to do 2 or 3 years in a college, get a visa. Any problem? No problem. Never has been. Then you go home, or you get a job here and you become part of the society, which is also a possibility. The third one, he says, is more problematic because that's people who want to join your nation. Now that would be the new Irish. That would be the people who are given citizenship like confetti. 1,100 quid out of petty cash. There you are now. Go down there and you'll get your passport and everything. Nobody's asked. And the next thing, these people are telling us they're Irish. And they're obviously not. And all that. Now, Thomas Aquinas says, in relation to that category, in the first place, those who are hostile to your culture, never, ever. Right? Very simple, and we kind of could speculate about who they might be. There are such categories, Gerry, and they're coming into our country. Secondly, he says, yes, it is possible for people to come from outside and join your nation after 2 to 3 generations, not the second week after you arrive off the plane. Now that might be, you might say, for modern day thinking, you might think that was a little bit extreme.
But I guess what he's
But the principle is solid. The principle is that, and he says that in that, it is not the responsibility of the indigenous population to make these people welcome. It is the responsibility of the newcomer to show that they have an affection and respect for your culture. Now, can you tell me, Gerry, if you've seen any evidence of the people who are being brought in now, in the last few years, of having any, they're coached by NGOs to have total disrespect for our culture, to abuse us, to gaslight us, to tell us that they'll be taking over soon and that we'll be on the boat.
I can get with the 2 to 3 in terms of to fully immerse into the culture of the country that you're trying to join, and also bring some of the elements to whatever your culture was here in terms, and that adds to the pot of stew, if you like.
100%, Gerry. And let me add that point. A very interesting thing happened after the famine, after the genocides, when Irish people started to go to America in their big numbers, and there were certain musicians that went who were really talented musicians, and what happened then? In America, they started to play around the bars with all kinds of Hungarians and Czechs and all kinds of musicians playing their own musics and joining in sessions. And then they started to record their music and send it back on discs, gramophone records in the first instance. And lo and behold, all these music came with all these kind of weird influences in them, still traditional. Like if you listen to, like a great fiddle player, like Irish fiddle player, like Sean Maguire, who is dead now for 20 years or so. He was from the north, in Belfast, I think. Brilliant player, but he was like a concert pianist. He wasn't like a fiddle player in the traditional sense at all. He was playing Irish music in the same rousing energy, but it sounded like a piece of classical music. And all these influences come into a culture, and they're hugely welcome and important. Vital. If you're forcing people on a culture and you don't know who they are and they're not supposed to have any papers and you don't make any demands of them except you infantilize them, and then you abuse your own people and batten them across the head because they actually ask a question or two, you can't expect a culture to result from that other than a culture of blackguardism and absolute evil.
What we've seen is, in terms of culture, is the dilution of culture. When we talk about, economic migration into the country, whatever type of refugees, all of it, this isn't a country like, we'll say, maybe even the UK, where you're talking maybe 4 or 5 different nationalities. Our Irish government have taken the approach that we can have 25, 30 different types of peoples and cultures coming in here.
It's a very interesting thing that's happened there, because the implication is that this is what's happened is some kind of spontaneous progressivism within the culture itself. In other words, that we suddenly wanted to become multicultural, and we couldn't wait to open our doors and our arms to all these foreigners without asking who they were or anything like that. That's not true at all. I remember a time, and it's not that long ago, in fact, the politician I'm going to mention now is all but a contemporary. He's Brian Lenihan, who ran for the presidency against Mary Robinson in 1990, and in fact won the popular vote, if we can say such a thing, as it happens. But of course we had a PR system, fine. Just saying. But he said, famously, on the Late Late Show, when there was a talk in the 80s about the new surges, the new waves of immigration, outward immigration, and people were beginning to worry about it, that it had returned after a brief lull in the late 60s and 70s, and people were now suddenly going to America, and there were illegals in America, and the undocumented, as they were called. There was all those Donnelly visas and all that came out of that. And he said, we can't all expect to live on one small island. Right? His contemporaries, they're still there.
Yeah, and that was an island that only has 3.5 million people on it at the time. It's about.
Yeah. And you see, this is the thing. It's all a big lie, Gerry. And you see, again, I come back to that thing. And sorry to interrupt your point there, but the pseudo-reality. When you don't have the media permitting independent voices to raise what might even in some instances, and a lot of instances, seem to be trivial questions. I mean, public discourse isn't all big ideas.
Not at all.
It can be small ideas.
But that's why maybe this is like the point, the relevant time to talk about like the pub culture element is the pseudo reality. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, whatever, 70s, 60s, the culture in the pub was every strand of society had to walk in the door, whether it was the doctor, the lawyer, the farmer, the lad on the dole, the lad on his way to England. And that's where a lot of, the problems of the reality outside the door were discussed freely and openly.
Totally.
Without fear of retribution, to a degree,
You could have hammer and tongs arguments.
Yeah. The pseudo-reality, as you speak about it, in my mind, has fed into these open places of kind of free discourse. Whereas in the old system, the old way was, there was a certain freedom to think, and that went out into the community around us.
That's right. Like we're in an old style pub now, like a really beautiful pub, and there's a TV there now. That's the one incongruity in the whole place, but it's not too obstreperous. So it's not, now, for the last 5 years, we've had propaganda beaming out of that thing in every room, virtually every front room in Ireland. Right. One of the first things they did in the lockdown was to close down the pubs. Stop people going to the pubs, right? That was the first thing that I remember. It was the middle of March in 2020. There was, because there was some kind of an episode that happened on a pub in Temple Bar, and said, "Oh, that's it." So now, and everybody's, "Oh, yeah." Now, the thing is, if you're in a pub and you're watching TV, or even if you're not in the pub all the time, but you go in, and you say you're going into the crowd that's there, and that TV is there, you'll meet an entirely different approach to what's on it than you will in somebody's front room. Mm-hmm. Where there's no reverence. It's like, because now they're in the community. Now they know each other. They know that and they know that they'll be picked up and maybe contradicted, or there'll be a row or whatever, and they'll row back and so on. So this was a kind of a checks and balances in the culture. The pub was an element. Like it had a kind of, I don't know, what is it? Beckett had a great line. Is the palaces of blasphemy and broken glass. And that's what they were. That's what the pubs were. Like, and now, because of, you can see now the pub trade is really under siege, like from these people, from these globalists and their minions on the ground. And they don't want people meeting. They don't want people discussing things. They want them to be staring at this thing.
Or staring at this thing in your hand.
Or at this thing in their hand, yeah. And imbibing this stuff, because that's what they want them to hear. And those checks and balances of people, I often think, like the example I used to say way back, do you remember back in the lockdown, this word cocooning came up, And I just, immediately I heard that word, because it's a very weird word. And suddenly I feel people were saying, "Oh, what were you doing over the weekend?" I was cocooning. Huh? Like, can you imagine the old fellas in this bar, like, saying, "Well, you cocooning there tonight, yes? Yeah, you're going cocooning, are you?" It's like the way that they would. I remember my uncle and my father, and they'd be across the street, and they'd come out the front door, and they'd look across at the other fella, like, and he'd say, "Are you going to the links this afternoon?" Total piss take. Because golf was, that was what
exactly
they did. You didn't do it. And it's that kind of, and that kind of banter attacked bad ideas.
100%, yeah.
And that's what these guys are so keen to stop. You just think about it, Gerry, like that, like, I remember my old friend Desmond Fennell used to always say, like, he says, how did democracy spread in Europe? Because it did in Europe, first of all, in the cafes. He says cafe culture was where democracy spread. And it wasn't just kind of intellectuals. It was the ordinary people talking and bantering and arguing with each other.
Well, your argument needed to stand up to so. You needed to, your idea or your argument needed a testing ground.
Yeah.
And no better, whether it was the cafe or in Ireland, we'll say the kind of pub culture. That was a perfect place to take it before you let it outside the town's
Yeah.
speed limits. Like
Culture developed all those kind of checks and balances and breaks and kind of ways of ridiculing and bantering and questioning and poo-pooing and dismissing stupid ideas. Like there's, you just think back, like, what happened in the lockdown, the way it was all accepted. I remember actually years and years ago, probably about possibly 30 years ago, the government in Ireland brought in a law against jaywalking, which is an American expression, obviously. That law probably lasted about 3 days until the guards gave up on even thinking about implementing it. You know perfectly well that whenever there's a bunch of Irish guys or women standing waiting at a traffic light, they're too busy talking to each other to notice when the light goes green. So they never try to cross until it's red, right? So they're always jaywalking. That's the nature of the Irish personality. Just as the Irish person, have you ever seen an Irish escalator in which people go like the Brits do, all on one side? No, it's not very late. Huh? What's your hurry? Huh?
Yeah.
You'll be up there soon enough. So, like, you know what I mean? Like, the Irish people had a great inbuilt kind of resistance to this kind of petty tyranny and petty kind of interference in their right to just do what they liked. I'll do it my own way. And you'll have that right across the spectrum now. We were talking about the weather. The government tells you how to, they tell you how to where you can go. You can't go to the beach because it's windy. I'll go to the beach. I'll take a risk. Life is risk. That's another thing that's part of this. That it's like now life isn't risky at all. It's not supposed to be. You can't take a risk. But I mean, and if it isn't risky, it's not life.
Well, the thing is, it's the marginal risk now is requiring a huge societal cost. I always kind of use the drink driving example. Is like, if you go back to the 80s, there was way too many people drinking and driving, and there was a lot of people getting killed on the roads.
There were other factors. I'm not excusing it, but I'm just saying that there were probably other factors, which was, the bad roads, which I prove in a different context.
Who knows them better?
But there was also, just the cars were pretty bad.
There was that, but I suppose the point is, getting on this is we brought those numbers down. Now we didn't, in terms of the pub culture, we all, I know the bad side of it better than anyone. But what I would have said is we didn't. When we're thinking about that culture, and to solve a problem of that culture, we'll say, people going to the pub, drinking and driving home, we didn't at all think of the long-term cost on the pro side to protect that culture, how we could help it.
Yeah, and again, Gerry, it's very important to point out that when you're talking about culture, you're not talking about some abstraction. No. You're talking about real people, living people. Yeah. You're talking about old fellas living on their own up the side of a mountain who might get one night in the pub in the week. And if they might get a lift in and a lift out, and they're dependent. That's their lifeline. That's their lifeline to cling on to sanity and humanity.
And I totally agree with that. And I suppose the main reason I was bringing up the deaths, we'll say, was we brought that number down to we brought it down drastically over a generation, right? But now I see in recent times again that deaths on our roads is coming up again in topical conversation by our political class, not acknowledging how much has been done, how much it's going to cost to save each new marginal life. So it comes back to risk.
Whenever you hear that, Gerry, you can be certain that there's something behind it, some kind of control device that they're thinking of, that they can push in order to supposedly deal with this problem. Now, because you see, at the very heart of all this whole question of cars and road deaths and so on, there's a very inconvenient truth about it, which is that when you actually stand at it, that there is an attitude that the benefit of cars in other contexts can outweigh a certain level of carnage on the roads. In other words, that there's an acceptable level of carnage. That is implicit in the entire kind of, attitude to it. Otherwise, they would just ban cars everywhere.
Well, if you try to invent cars in today's climate, if we lived in a world, didn't have cars, but we had all the other nonsense that we have in the outer world, there's no way they'd allow a car onto the road. Do you know what I mean?
Not the way the roads are structured. Because if you think about it, I always think it is a bit mad, actually, Gerry, when you think about, when you have a lot of roads, and you have cars going at 80 kilometres an hour and 100 kilometres, and they're that far apart going down little road, I think the time will come in cultures when people will not be able to believe that actually ever happened. Because I think if they were designing roads now, what they would do is they would have one lane going one way and another lane going another way, and a big space in between it, which was rather than not a wall, but a place where you could have a soft landing. I suppose what this goes to really is that a lot of what's happening to us is being forced upon us. This is the common ingredient of it all. Nobody's asking people anymore, and there's no media anymore to discuss things in any way.
There's no opposite side presented, so you take the book there. I like to hear a 2-hour debate in RT about climate change and whatever you want to say, as long as you can get the fair representation of the other side and not pretend one doesn't exist.
This is a very interesting thing, Gerry, that, we think, when would you say this kind of became a problem? When, can you put a finger on it?
I can't really put a finger. I do think the Celtic Tiger collapse sped that process up.
Definitely. But I think there was a slow burn before that, because I remember, when I was in the mainstream, in the Irish Times and so on, when it was a decent newspaper, I used to spend a lot of time every day on TV and radio, believe it or not. I'd be out on radio at 5 o'clock in the morning and I'd be still out at midnight, in a TV studio. And that was 3 or 4 nights a week. So I was getting a lot of requests. And one of the things that used to intrigue me increasingly was that the nature of the debates was changing. One time...
When did your media requests start to evaporate?
Oh.
That might be a good way of figuring this out.
Well, it's very simple. It's 2014, but it was in some way my own doing at that point, because I had seen the writing on the wall. And basically I realised now that we were dealing with an entirely different media. I had done an interview trying to defend a particular position because I'd been attacked by certain parties viciously, and was... And I did this one interview that I thought would actually, with the Sun Independent, and it was basically set up. And at one point, there was a question put to me, which was because I had gone through a lot of stuff, and the question was, are you suicidal, are you depressed? And my answer was, oh look, there's no such thing as depression. Right? That statement, which is at top of the head, you say, can we get on to what we're supposed to talk about? That's what essentially you were saying. There was absolute bedlam. Now, I didn't even think at the time, well, of course, Big Pharma runs Ireland. Right? That was what it was all about, really, the way it was stoked. But, I realised then that everybody, all the media were contacting me and asked me to go on, but they were going on to basically put me on trial. And I said, no, I'm not doing it. And then I said, I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not playing with you anymore. This is not a game. But for years before that, I'd begun to notice something that I would remark on. The producers and researchers didn't seem to welcome me in the way they had before as someone who was able to stir up a good row with other people and fight my corner and give a good program, have a good discussion, which is, the whole objective. No. Now they wanted to win the argument. The whole objective was to defeat me and to line up the panel so that I would be the one who was beaten. I used to say this to Desmond Fennell, I said, we're suckers. We're just being put out there to defeat us.
Yeah.
I said, look at you, Desmond, come on, you've got your phone, you're a sitting duck,
But they're not even going to the trouble of having your role in the seat now.
It was no longer the important thing. The important thing was presenting the progressive argument as the righteous argument and the winning argument.
And if you like, the creation of the pseudo reality is then to get the viewer to think 85% of the people think this way, or 90%
Yeah.
so there's no need. We're all agreed on this.
And then beyond that, there's something wrong with you. You know, it's not just that you have a different opinion, like because they would say, well, you're an intelligent guy, like, you know, that kind of way, which is kind of that passive aggressive thing, you know, like, how come you're such a lunatic, you know? That was the unspoken part, you know. No, this is the point of view that I have based on my upbringing, my reading, my understanding of reality, and my perspective on the future, which nobody else seemed to think about. I mean, you know, when you actually think about it, Gerry, like, I wrote through the 90s and 2000s critiques of progressivism, but also of growth, of economic kind of liberalism, and neoliberalism as it's now called, and all this foreign direct investment, you know, the pitfalls of that. And I was absolutely, and against the EU.
Well, that's the uneasy alliance that's required to keep this reality going, because in a sense it can't exist without the funding of big pharma, big tech, big industry.
Yeah, very interesting thing happened there last year, about the middle of last summer. This report came out by an American think tank called the Newman Forum. Now they were somewhat Catholic, I think, in their general outlook, but that's, you know, a very highly professional survey they did. Their objective was to kind of look at the effects of foreign direct investment in culture, and they chose Ireland as their laboratory specimen. And the strange thing was that they came up with a whole lot of conclusions about links between that culture of FDI and certain pathologies in a society, such as, say, suicide, crime, increasing crime, all those kind of things, all those negative things that society, you know, drug addiction. And they did an extraordinary analysis looking at the impact of FDI in really microscopic detail in the actual towns where there were these kinds of factories, and in the kinds of results that we're getting there. And it was really devastating. I wrote a book in 1997 which has all this in it. Like both the pathologies and the FDI and the economic situation, the Celtic Tiger had just started. And I was writing about these connections at that time. And yet, people regarded me as a kind of a crackpot. Then and now.
Then you and people like you in, we'll say, print journalism were given a platform, because there was an acceptance that you had an ability, and people like that had an ability to look at the world a different way.
Exactly.
And it was important to hear that, even if you didn't go down the avenues they went down, it was still played an important part.
That's interesting too, because that is certainly the case. When I joined the Irish Times in 1990, that was kind of like the deal. The editor actually expressly said to me, you know, I want you because you worked in Dublin and Hot Press and McGill in alternative magazines, and you have a different way of seeing the world. That's what I want. He says, I don't want you turning into the same kind of drone as the rest of these guys I have around
that
here.
didn't happen anyway.
Yeah. Right? And it changed gradually in the way I'm talking about, in the media in general. But then it changed. It's like the old thing about how did it happen? Well, first slowly, then quickly. Mm-hmm. And then I realized in 2014 that I was being attacked by my own colleagues in the Irish Times on Twitter on a nightly basis for actually doing the job they'd employed me to do, which is to express my opinion about what was going on in the world.
Will you say, I think one of the biggest problems we've had, and we'll say if you look at the evolution of social media, particularly Twitter as a platform for news, which it became really, you had the situation developing where journalists, opinion makers, had their own personal platforms of followers that were separate to their newspaper, separate to the media. And then that became, you know, depending on how big or large those numbers were, and they'd be quite huge back in those days. They had to factor in those, their personal following. So they got to find out what type of person was kind of jiving with what they were writing based on
Yes.
their followership. So when they start to talk about stuff, if they write, in their newspaper, they were largely anonymous. There were, there's a handful of people that were well known, like you and that, but most journalists were anonymous. And now they had a personal platform of followers that was separate to their day-to-day work.
Yeah, but one of the things that happened as well was that due to the collapse of the mainstream media business model, that the newspapers and media organisations generally corporately began to understand that this was the future. That having these guys out there representing their paper and getting involved in controversies and drawing
it
into the paper, that was instead of the old model of record, newspaper of record, fair and unbiased but vigorous commentary, etc., etc. And literacy, for example, which is gone as well. And that's really what happened to media.
You write, I write, and there's a kind of flotilla of small boats starting to emerge and kind of Substack and places like that. Is part of what we have to do then kind of almost to create the spaces as much as the content.
That's right.
Do you know what I mean?
And as it were, to kind of, I don't know, I hate the word re-educate, but it's kind of like that people need to understand or to find out that there's a great world out there of alternative media. And that they could actually, if they just learn a few tricks. And I mean, I'm not being patronising, because I'm pretty slow to absorb technological developments. And my wife is far better at it than me, and she has to teach me, or my stepdaughter teaches me how to do it. So I'm slow about that. But then it's easy enough once you learn a few things and you get on the YouTube, or you get to find where, Odyssey is, or whatever it is. And people just need to kind of get to that stage where they be to realise that you don't need the Late Show anymore because it's no good anyway. And you don't need the Irish Times anymore because it's terrible anyway. What you need is just a different kind of a menu that of your own choosing of sources that you learn to trust, that suit your personality, and you trust in the sense that they're telling you the truth, because you can check it across one to the other. And you can very soon learn to read this. And that this is a whole new way of apprehending the world that we would have years ago thought was completely impossible. But actually now it's the only way forward.
Like we can talk about the climate one, is like, that narrative has been presented and funded by our government for the last 3 years, right? And I can link that back to, I'll never forget when the Galway-Dublin motorway opened. And it was like, I don't know how many years it took to complete. About a month later, John Gormley, I think it was, the Green Party, just going back 6 or 7, was on about having 60 kilometre an hour speed limits on the motorway for, climate.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So, and investing billions in a product.
Well, I mean, that came up.
Slow you down.
You refresh my mind, Gerry, but there was an incident there. I think might have been Common the Man or one of those bodies, whereby at a meeting with RTE, the question came up. There was a report in a newspaper about this, that there had been an insinuation or an assertion at the meeting that there would be a linkage between the funding and the amount of climate-related material that was being broadcast. Now, that's clearly Pravda.
Well, what else would you call it? It's like your Galway. It's like, I used to have a shop once upon a time, a computer repair shop. And if you went into the free Mayo Advertiser or Galway Advertiser and you said, you want to take on an ad, I said, well, if you take on an ad, we'll write a piece on your business for you. Do you know what I mean? And, they weren't going to write a piece that was saying, down with this sort of thing. It was going to be a promotional piece of your business.
Yeah. Advertorial. Yeah. So, but it was always marked as such. Just kind of harmless in that sense. I remember, if somebody had a new shop opening, I got a couple of, when I was starting out, assignments of this kind myself, way back in the local papers, where there'd be somebody opening a new shop, and all the other shopkeepers in the town, there would be an article about the new shop, and everybody else would take an ad around it, and that would pay for a couple of pages. That was part of the newspaper's income, and you would write this appalling puff piece about the shop and what a great shop it was, and you could get shoes in it and so on. People are not in tune enough with, they may notice something's wrong with their newspaper. It's not the same as it was. It's sloppier maybe.
I think they are on that road now, though.
Yes.
I think it's a question of how far down that road people are.
But what there's numerous things you can see clearly that one of the things that's gone is consequences for politicians, for example. Like the old story was that if a politician got into trouble in the media and could be a personal scandal, it could be a business scandal, it could be something in the political domain. If it went on for any more than a few days, like Alistair Campbell said, a week, by the weekend, if you were still in the Sunday papers, you were toast. That was the rule of thumb. And you were gone by Monday. You could predict it, it's nightfall day. That stopped. Like now they can say anything, do anything, and it'll just blow over, because there's no
consequences.
Yeah, and there's no contrary voice permitted in to stir it, which is what you need to stir it.
And there's no turbulence within the political parties themselves.
No,
it's in the manner there was in the 80s and 90s.
And the way you can see this, Gerry, I think something struck me over the weekend. It was an example of like what this silence brings about as a composer, where you can make a direct comparison, sure as anything, with the final taking off of the 46A bus in Dublin. Now, the 46A, country people won't know this, but the 46A is the most famous bus. It's like, that's the one that went to Dunleary and Belfield and those places. Like, it was like, there's this most quintessential Dublin bus, They take it off after 99 years, steeped in legend and, affection. And they just take it off without any consultation, and there's nothing about it. It happens. It just goes. It's gone. The 46A is gone.
They're not aware of what's gone.
Maybe there will come yet, but there's no commentary, like the kind of people that you would expect to come out and say, like in the old days, Kevin Myers would come out in the Irish Times and he would absolutely tear it apart, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody would laugh at what he said about it and how ridiculous it was. And there was a good chance that it would be back by the following weekend because of that. That's not happening now. And it's not going to happen, There's lots of aspects like that you kind of say, no, it's not, there's no traction anymore for any kind of criticism. So they can do what they want, essentially. The bus company knows that they're not going to meet any resistance, and they can just do it. And within 2 days, whatever rumbling there was is gone, it's died down, and it's over, and the bus is gone. And this is it sounds like a trivial thing. I don't believe it's a trivial thing. This is cultural vandalism of the work.
Well, you're talking about cultural points that, and even if we tie back to where we're sitting, is, we know the pop culture is important because it's in our history.
Yeah.
It's in our literature. It's in our poetry.
Yeah.
It's there. So we know that, we know from that, you can nearly say, we know from that the significance of what was going on these buses, or whether it was in a pub or what.
Well, buses are important. I mean, I remember when I came to Dublin first, getting the bus in, it was the 45, I was out in Dundrum, Ballantyre way, and getting the bus in, you'd meet people, and there was a talking place you would talk.
Mm-hmm.
It's like my father's van, and then down the west, when he was driving the mail car, and he'd carry people sitting on the mail bags. And that was a place that they would meet and talk on the way to Ballahadreen, And that's kind of gone, and there's no respect for it. But you kind of have to wonder too if this kind of thing is kind of inevitable now in this multicultural Ireland. Because obviously, whatever proportion of the population is, apart from the cultures like myself, and I'm one of the rare cultures who know what the 46A is, or was, but that most of these people never heard of the 46A, or maybe they were on it, but they don't know what it is. It doesn't mean anything to them. But this is what culture is. Things that mean something to a people, in small things and large things. It can be the poetry of Yeats, or it could be the 46A. They're in a certain sense equally important in the great scheme of things. And I think that's lost. You see, and that's another aspect then, that we don't have people in government who have any capacity to talk about these things, other than in a frivolous, dismissive way. I read a headline there apparently, or my wife read it out to me about that the Irish Independent was delighted that, Stability was now returned to Ireland because a safe pair of hands, those of Micheál Martin, were now. God Almighty! Like, where have they been for 5 years?
Well, this is
the destruction of our country, root and branch, in 5 years.
Well, this is why sometimes I wonder, in relation to the storm, even when people see it, I'm very struck at the aftermath and watching how slowly it's taken the state and arms of the state to respond, and that infrastructure is almost worse than it was when we had no money.
Yeah.
And I brought up the Supermax example. Bring up that example is, what happens if Supermax isn't open? What are you going to do?
Yeah.
How are you going to eat for the next 2 days or 3 days or a week? And I wonder, are people, does an event like that resonate in people and says, to make them think in those terms, as in, you mean I can only survive for a day if everything shuts down? What am I, those conversations?
I think that's where the denial kicks in. Don't want to hear, if they start to think about those things, they'll go crazy. Because that is the reality. We have 3 days of food supply in the normal kind of channels that are open, the food chains. And if that breaks down, if scarcities happen, there's nothing to eat, there's nothing in the supermarket.
There's nowhere to drive in your electric car with no electricity.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, anybody who had been foolish enough to buy an electric car last week, have one last, and no backup, no diesel aspect or whatever, they were stuck. There's nowhere to charge your car. And the authority at the time down the west were telling, well, it could take a week. We don't know. We don't care. Actually.
It could take longer. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me really, Gerry, was this is something I noticed, and it seemed so trivial at the time that I felt like a bit of a crank even to refer to it. The first sign, maybe about 20 years ago, of what I would call the blatant expression of total contempt and indifference to the people of the country, started to occur in piecemeal. One of the signs I saw was, in the DART stations there was this line on the platform, and it used to say, "Please stay inside the yellow line." They took out the "please."
Okay.
Please took out the "please." I noticed that, and I said, nobody else noticed it. That was about 20 years ago. And the next one I saw, I used to see these road signs, all these roadworks would pop up. One time, there'd be a man with a shovel and he'd fix the road.
And 2 bollards and a piece of twine going across it.
Now there was 14 kind of trucks and about 1 million bollards now.
And a health and safety, project plan to do it.
Who makes those bollards? They must be millionaires. They're just going on forever, and there's nothing happening. But here's the thing, I used to see this sign, and suddenly it came out of nowhere. Expect delays. That was that's us. Expect F all. You think you have somewhere to go? No, you don't. We'll decide when you go. And that's the attitude now of the state to the people. And that's what was writ large during the COVID. They were practicing with all those little mechanisms. I'm convinced of it.
You could see that the pandemic infrastructure was coming in the preparation for this event. Was all starting to kind of roll out, the factories, the schools, the shops, the post office, everything's going to be closed. But what I don't think they fully recognised is, for a storm that lasted half a day, how slowly it takes to really reopen again, fully.
Yeah. Well, there was several days of announcement and
So you think you've got a state that's fully in control of what it's doing because they know about this thing for 5 days before it happens. And then it happens, and everybody, you have a lad, on News Talk explaining that, the signalling goes from red and then to orange, and it's
You see, my biggest regret about the whole thing, my whole regret on that Friday, was that I wasn't in Sligo and have a photograph of my greenhouse, I would have made a fortune. Because every TV station, every newspaper wanted sign of any kind of carnage, and boy was this carnage.
How will they present far right? Far right John Waters' greenhouse.
Climate denier Waters.
Great news. This is great.
Climate denier Waters gets it up. It sounds like it's funny, but it's not.
No.
It's awful. Are they going to use this? Are they going to succeed? Or are people going to understand what's really going on in time to stop them using it to basically close us down completely? So that we will come to the point where we'll almost expect a lockdown of some kind every day.
What would it be like now? This is a familiar thing the whole country can get around. A winter storm.
Yeah.
Trees down, roofs off. Everybody's gone through it and done what they were supposed to do, right? But if we get an unusual kind of climate event in the summer, we'll say there's 3 days of 100 degrees weather that we're not used to. That suddenly the apparatus kicks into fashion in that sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the ridiculous thing about it all along for the last couple of years. We've noticed this, that even a bit of ice on the road and it's climate change, it's the end of the world. In the summertime, the temperature goes over 20 degrees. Oh my God, it's global warming. We're all finished. We're going to fry.
Well, you can even see the way they've changed. I saw this recently where they've changed the colouring for the different degree levels.
Yes.
So that, like, when you're at 20 or 25 degrees now, it's dark red.
Yeah.
Whereas it was like a light red.
That's
10
right.
years ago.
Yeah, and or it was orange or whatever.
And it was less, visually impactful.
Yeah, now it's like you look, we're frying, and you're freezing. You're going around with your jacket on you, But people go around with their coats on them and scarves and still think it's climate, it's global warming. You know what I mean? Like, they don't get it. It's going to take a long time, because you see, at the back of all this is hundreds of years in which trust was built up in the mastheads of these newspapers. And nobody knows now, or they can't believe, that they're run by a pack of liars. People just find that impossible to believe. I say to people, that the newspapers are full of lies now. Really? What? And I know they are, going to go off and say, that guy's got, it's worse than ever, worse than ever. So, you're kind of on a hiding to nothing at the moment, but I think it's important to keep saying it at the same time. Just point out to them, do you not notice that, the Irish Times is not the same as it used to be? Because people say to me, people think I'm still in the Irish Times, It's like I'd read you the paper, When?
Yeah.
But, the point is that it's it's not the same. You got to look at it closely. Look at what's in it. Look at what they're trying to do to you. Look at the obsessions they have. Look at how they treat.
Well, that's a good word. The obsessions.
Yeah, it's obsessions, and there's the migration. They have to promote that. The climate change. They have to promote that. It's not in any way neutral. They'll cover up if a crime is committed by an immigrant. It's the name is camouflaged. He's talked about Tipperary man, blah blah, all this stuff. It's just horrible. Gaslighting.
But what you would say then is, going back to what you were saying about the McWilliams piece, is there's a slight roll back in terms of the thinking. So I think that structure, because I think it's the Trump effect, if you like.
Maybe that's...
There might be an element of that coming in, is that... McWilliams is a significant bellwether for me as to what's the current thinking about what way Ireland is going.
Yeah.
And he's usually pretty on with what way Ireland is going, and not the way I probably
officially,
want to see it. Officially, Ireland is going.
Yeah.
So it would seem to me, we've had the election of Trump, we've had our new government, right? And that there's a gentle, very, very gentle stepping back from some of these, policies. And it's coming, just slightly translating through to the media. So McWilliams' article for me would be a bellwether in some degree. And that only speaks to me in the sense the people must be starting to
On
move.
the other hand, Gerry, I just remember what was the actual core of that article in The Independent I mentioned about it, Micheál Martin, the safe pair of hands. Actually, the story really, the core of it was the idea that the Irish election having followed on from the American election by 3 weeks later or whatever, that was a reaction against the election of Trump. That the Irish people had been, so eminently sensible and stable in every way, had chosen to put back in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, these safe pair, and Micheál Martin, the safest pair of hands you could possibly imagine, and that this was, the future. Now it's in The Independent, so
But here's the thing: I love how they tried to present Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael as a left-wing parties. These are. We've never voted for a left wing, with all our progressivism, and all that. And I'm not saying that the both of them socially are very progressive, but here, the way I would have looked at that election has no. I don't think the American election had any real effect on it.
Not really. No, I don't think there were even more. But the progressive thing, obviously, I think it comes in through the American influence.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's who's really running Ireland. I mean,
not the corporate interest. We saw it with the Occupied Territories Bill.
Yeah.
That, again, I was referencing this in an article. There was 25 NGOs behind this bill. It had gathered a huge momentum in the run-up to the general election. And it was all to do with, not trading basically with occupied territories like the West Bank and Israel. So all of the government policy has been anti-Israel for 2 years. I don't care what anyone says. I would put it as anti-Israel rather than going any other way. But so this bill should be a no-brainer to get through the door. Do you know what I mean? In official Ireland.
Yeah.
Yet the day before Trump takes office, Micheál Martin comes out and says, this bill is great. So that would say to me that they are kind of, there's a good point, is I probably wouldn't agree with the bill, but there's a bad point is if Irish people tried to knock that bill, it might take them 3 years to do it, to build up enough steam, enough opposition to it. Whereas a new outside government said, or corporate, or wherever it came from.
It goes to show that we've totally lost our sovereignty. We've totally lost our independent mindedness. Nothing. What the people of Ireland think doesn't matter to figs. It's what outsiders want and what they think that matters. And that's ultimately what we've come down to now in our country, whereby it is simply a rock in the Atlantic on which various transactions happen on a daily basis, and the people are just kind of moving, the indigenous people are kind of there, but they're not really wanted anymore, and would they not just clear off or something, because we've got a job to do here, we're trying to run an economy. That's kind of the vibe you're getting, and I don't think your Paddy has picked that up yet. He will, maybe, but I hope it's not too late when he does. That whole thing about the FDI and those towns and villages, that was one of the revelations in that survey by the Newman Forum, was that in areas where there were foreign corporations, American corporations, the voting results were markedly different than they were in other places where there was no factories. In other words, they were more progressive. And that's why, so we imported all this stuff.
Well, yeah, the culture.
There's a link between the money and the...
I've worked in a couple of, my last multinational job, one of the issues, I think it was sold during the pandemic as well, and that had an effect on things. But you certainly got a feeling, if I go back to the first job coming out of college in a multinational to the last one, you felt the culture of the corporation was being piped into to the Irish arm of it. And that had almost kind of piped itself out into the community, do you know what I mean?
That's
because
exactly
nobody wanted to lose their job.
No, and I suppose in that culture, this as well. You can't even mutter out of line against that interest.
No.
I mean, if the word got out, I remember back home at my own hometown in Castlereagh in County Roscommon when they were bringing in the prison years ago. And anybody who was against the prison was basically shunned. And it's jobs. Now everybody found out in due course of what they were told to begin with, that in a town where there's a prison, None of the people who work in the prison actually live in the town. So it makes no difference whatsoever to the economy of the town. It's just a blight on your town. But nobody knew that at the time. But I remember people being shunned, and you were told, "Shut up now, don't be stirring the pot here."
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely.